During the third week of development, the embryo is a flat, three-layered disc with each layer containing germ cells that give rise to the organs and tissues of the body. The ventral or bottom germ layer is called the endoderm, and it forms the lining of the gut tube and the respiratory system. The middle germ layer is called the mesoderm, and it forms connective tissues like muscles and bones. And the dorsal or top germ layer is called the ectoderm, and it gives rise to the sensory organs like the skin, the eyes, and the central nervous system. The mesoderm differentiates into paraxial mesoderm, intermediate mesoderm, and lateral plate mesoderm. And around day 19, a space forms in the lateral plate mesoderm. This space, called the intraembryonic coelom or cavity, separates the lateral plate mesoderm into dorsal and ventral layers. The dorsal layer is the parietal mesoderm layer, and its cells adhere with cells from the overlying ectoderm and wrap around the amnion. The ventral layer is called the visceral mesoderm layer, and its cells adhere to cells from the underlying endoderm, which covers the yolk sac. Parietal mesoderm gives rise to the serous membranes that line the different cavities in the body, and visceral mesoderm becomes the serous membrane that covers the lungs, heart, and abdominal organs. And these are really important because they prevent the organs from getting injured as they rub up against each other or against the body wall. During the fourth week of development, the embryo undergoes structural changes, transitioning from a trilaminar disc into a more cylindrical shape. The combined visceral mesoderm and endoderm layer, which lines the yolk sac, fold rostral and caudally, which creates a primitive gut tube out of the yolk sac, and leaves the remainder of the yolk sac in the middle section of the gut. While that's happening, the combined parietal mesoderm and ectoderm folds down with the amnion, which forms the lateral body folds, which eventually merge and become the anterior body wall of the embryo, what you might think of as the chest. This creates a gut tube inside a body tube, or more simply, a tube inside a tube, in the rostral and caudal parts of the embryo. But there's still the yolk sac poking out in the midsection. At this point, the dorsal portion of the yolk sac has become a part of the gut tube, while the connecting stalk between the yolk sac and the gut tube is renamed the vitelline duct. A ridge of double-layered visceral mesoderm forms the dorsal mesentery, and it suspends the gut tube from the body wall as it dangles in the embryonic cavity. This pendulous flap of tissue was only recently classified as an organ, and it provides a pathway for blood vessels, nerves, and lymphatics to reach the various body organs. Of course, the body doesn't have one continuous cavity. Around day 22, a thick plate of visceral mesoderm called the septum transversum forms just cranial to the vitelline duct, and it starts to divide the thoracic cavity and abdominal cavity. Around the fifth week of development, two flaps of tissue called the pleuropericardial folds grow out of the lateral body wall and fuse together to divide the thoracic cavity into two pleural cavities that house the lungs, and a pericardial cavity that houses the heart. In the seventh week of development, two more flaps of tissue, this time pleuroperitoneal membrane tissue, grow ventrally from the body wall and fuse with the septum transversum to completely seal off the thoracic cavity from the peritoneal cavity. At that point, there are pericardial and pleural cavities in the thorax, and the peritoneal cavity in the abdomen. There's also the diaphragm, which is the large muscular organ that separates the abdominal and thoracic cavity. Mesodermal cells from the third, fourth, and fifth pairs of somites penetrate the pleuroperitoneal membranes and form the muscular portion of the diaphragm. Meanwhile, the two crura of the diaphragm, which are the two main tendons that tether it to the vertebral column, come from the mesoderm of the lumbar region. Alright, as a quick recap. By the end of week 3, the lateral plate mesoderm divides into parietal and visceral mesoderm, and they form the serous membranes for the developing organs, and also establish the pleural, pericardial, and peritoneal cavities. Finally, mesoderm from the third, fourth, and fifth somites help give rise to the muscular portion of the diaphragm.